Welcome, my friends. Thank you for joining us on this live stream. It's an honor to be your guest for this very important Outdoor Camp 2021, Present Truth. And boy, present truth, you really begin to understand when you study prophetic truth. And prophetic truth is something that you begin to understand more deeply when you study history. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint, and I'm going to share some history with you on the topic of liberty, and particularly the founding of America. I've got the flag behind me here as really a symbol, yes, of a nation, but much more than that. It's not a tribalistic, nationalistic message when we understand the principles of America's founding are divine principles: liberty of conscience, the universal aspirations of mankind for human rights, human freedom and dignity, private property, the family, and all of the principles of liberty of conscience and freedom of conscience that are under attack in our time, as I'm sure you've noticed. So give me a moment to start this right up and go to share screen. There's always that moment where the presenter can't multitask while doing some clicking, and he has some filler comments that I am having right now that are not substantive in any way, but we will get to the substance right now. This is a series that I had the privilege to do for Amazing Facts recently, and it was called America's 11th Hour. And I'm going to put my presenter view there so that I also can see the notes if needed, and you'll see the notes as well. But the main slide there, they put together with their amazing graphics over at Amazing Facts. But 400 years was a major anniversary here in my country, in America. You might be aware of the Pilgrims if you've read The Great Controversy. But as a kid, I learned a lot about history, whether it was celebrating Black history in America and the contributions there, the civil rights movement and people who'd come up from slavery, the founding fathers, Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, as I mentioned, the Pilgrims and Indians. That was a history that was celebrated because we were, yes, brutally honest about the grievous sins of the past, but also celebrating the development of liberty. And that has gone global, and we know it's going to be really shrinking down in the last days. But we had a 400th anniversary in 2020. The year was 1620 that those pilgrims who came over and fled England to find freedom to worship as the dictates of conscience and the Bible demanded of them, they held their first worship services. Protestantism came to this shore in 1620. Well, 300 years later, alcohol was prohibited. You could not buy, sell, manufacture alcohol nationwide in 1920. So I guess last year we had the 100th anniversary of Prohibition. So how did we celebrate in 2020 the 400th anniversary of free worship services and the 100th anniversary of alcohol prohibition? Well, you probably are aware in many countries, church services were shut down and alcohol stores, liquor stores remained open. That was a pretty tragic and dark irony to many people. But this year, 2021, we can give ourselves another chance at this because this was a 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth Rock, coming to New England. And this, of course, is a global message because it's about the Great Controversy. You'll read quotations in the Great Controversy in just a moment. But I also like the concept that this is not, the principles of freedom are universal, right? And when I was a kid in school and we studied the Black history, as I mentioned, one of my favorite poems that I learned was by the famous Black poet, African-American poet named Langston Hughes. And he said, "I too sing America." And frankly, that can be somebody from any country, from any nationality, any religion can say principles of freedom are something that can unite. And so that is a beautiful thing for where the Spirit of the Lord is. There is, you know the answer to that, there is liberty. The Bible says God has made from one blood all nations and peoples who dwell on the earth. We are all his offspring, and we can be adopted and have the inheritance of sonship as well through the blood and merits of Jesus Christ, through repentance and confession of sin and coming to the cross and becoming converted as Christians. Then we are truly his sons, and we call Jesus the elder brother of the human race. In Revelation 7, they wave the palm branches, people from every nation, tribe, people, and language coming together in that unity. Well, here's the prophecy that I mentioned that the history we're going to study is actually going to reveal. You're familiar with Revelation 12, I hope. If you aren't, study through Revelation 12, 13, 14. It's the climax of the book of Revelation. It's everything about the time in which we live and the years that preceded since the time of Jesus. Revelation 12 covers it all, 1,260 years of papal persecution and the woman, the true church of God, fleeing into the wilderness. But then it says in verse 15, read here on the screen with me, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. Waters represent in Bible prophecy multitudes of people, large populations. So he's sending forces after her to destroy her and carry her away. But the opposite of water helps out the woman. Earth, the earth helped the woman. Oh, it's the opposite of many multitudes of people would be a more sparsely populated place. The earth helped the woman. A very important phrase here. This actually foreshadowed and prophesied the foundations of this free nation that the pilgrims began in 1620. The earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman. Do you know this part? This is a key text for those who are present truth believers. The remnant of her seed is what the dragon, Satan, makes war against. And who is the remnant church of Bible prophecy? That's the seed of the woman, the descendants of the true church of God. In the last days, the last verse of Revelation 12 are those that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. So do you see the connection between the earth, the sparsely populated place, opening itself to the woman to help the true church of God? And then that's where the woman gives birth to the seed. The remnant church of Bible prophecy came from America and went global. There was Advent awakening movements all over the world, but the church itself was birthed and organized in, interestingly, New England, the very place that the pilgrims landed. There's the scripture I mentioned earlier that waters are the multitudes and nations and tongues. So waters, earths, those are opposites. I'm going to move a little quickly because our technology wasn't cooperating this evening, so I was a little bit late, so forgive me for moving so quickly. But here's the quotation from the Great Controversy that I wanted to share with you. This is about the pilgrims. They were followers of providence. It says, when God's hand seemed pointing them across the sea to a land where they might found for themselves a state and leave to their children the precious heritage of religious liberty. What did they do when God's hand pointed them to leave the Netherlands, where they were seeking refuge from the tyranny of England and the church state of the Anglican Church? They were in a free nation called the Netherlands. The Dutch there had a time of religious toleration, but that was not where they were to be. God's hand was pointing them, and they went forward without shrinking in the path of providence. I hope that's our life's calling. When God points us the path of providence and duty, we follow unflinchingly without shrinking because we have faith in the one who has called us. He is the Almighty God. When we know God is leading, and they didn't even know they were fulfilling prophecy, but they still did what God told them to do. We saw the connection between the earth helps the woman and then the seed of the woman. Fascinating fact. You ready for an amazing fact? I mean, I'm not coming to you with amazing facts today. This was a Liberty and Health Alliance invitation. I have the joy and privilege to serve as vice president for Liberty and Health Alliance, and I've been a speaker for Amazing Facts. I have my own ministry called Belt of Truth Ministries as well. But here's your amazing fact for the day. The first baby born on the New England shores to the Pilgrim Fathers was named Peregrine. What's his last name there? White. Did you know the first baby born, generations on down, a couple hundred years later, gave birth to James White? So that James White's great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first baby born on the New World when the Pilgrims came over in 1620. I find that to be prophetic and historic. It's beautiful that the earth helped the woman, and then the remnant of her seed comes out. Now, 1617 was an important year, though. This was 3 years before they landed at Plymouth Rock. And in 1617, the Pilgrims were praying about and considering a move across the ocean, which sounded crazy at the time. I mean, hardly anybody had done it. There were some Jamestown colonists, and there were some rumors about America. That's the place with three-headed snakes and saber-toothed tigers and cannibals that will boil your children alive and skin them, and all these things that they were told. So wait a minute. We can't stay in the Netherlands because their treaty with Spain is going to expire in 3 years. That would be 1620. where the Spanish might crack down again, and we'll be under Catholic rule, and we won't have religious toleration in the Netherlands. So we have to make a decision now. Are we going to start saving money, selling property, getting the preparations for getting a ship to go across the ocean? And in 1617, also at the very same time, there was a warlike tribe in New England who had been tragically decimated by a plague, or you could say providentially, but either way, when they perished, the tribe that had been the scourge of New England to fellow Indians and to anybody who came around, they happened to perish by a plague. All of them except one that we know of, who is named Squanto, who became very good friends with the Pilgrims, but that's a whole other story. But it was in 1617, that same year, that God was pointing his finger. The earth is now available. The earth will help out the woman. And they knew God was leading them. And they made that decision after prayer, after a vote that they took. And they said, we will move forward as God has led. Now, that's going to be a relatively safe place now with the warlike tribe gone. And then they will make good friends with the Wampanoag tribe. That's the Pilgrims and Indians. If you've ever heard the American, stories and how we have our Thanksgiving every year in November and children dress up as Pilgrims and Indians, all that fun stuff is real true history. These were two very, very different types of people, and they found a bond of peace. And it's remarkable that the indigenous peoples were able to look at these pilgrims not based on the color of their skin or their nationality, because these Indians knew about bad Englishmen, the notorious slave trader Thomas Hunt, and the mistreatment that had taken place by the Spanish and others. They knew what they had seen by others who were similar, but they said, let's judge them by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. So they were able to look past that and overcome prejudice. And that went both ways, with the Pilgrims treating these Indians unlike other Europeans that you know about who have so exploited native populations. But this was a beautiful thing that I think we all need to celebrate, because there's so much division in society right now. We know that's only just the devil's scheme to divide and conquer. But here we can say a beautiful story of people who were brave. They came across the ocean. William Bradford, one of their leaders, said, all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties and must be both enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. So he's saying there were difficulties that were not invincible, but the things that were feared, providence and good care, we can overcome them. I'm going to skip through that a little bit quicker because I want to get to some other content as well. But they held that day of prayer. They held a vote. They heard their leader, William Bradford, one of their leaders. He was a young man at the time, but he said, let's go forward in faith and duty. And they did. You may know about the Mayflower story. This is famous for American children to learn about these pilgrims who got aboard, 102 of them. And William Bradford said the ship was wickedly shaken. And you could say that's quite literally, because the serpent spews out the water at the woman. And this is maybe a literal little symbol of that as well. But they, when they arrived, I'm going to skip through a lot of details. If you go to the Amazing Facts website or go to Granite Bay Hilltop Church YouTube channel, you can find the whole 4-part series that I did on America's 11th hour. There's so many interesting stories of courage, of faith. But the real bottom line is that it was expected that you would have several casualties on a journey like this that began in the fall with limited provisions. These people are poor, and 2 people only out of 102, only 2 perished on the journey. Now, you might say, well, when something has a case fatality rate of less than 1%, we tend to just overthrow our entire lives and our duty and our humanity and our liberty and our conscience and our assembling of ourselves together. We reorient everything about what it means to be human for this generation of children growing up, not seeing faces. I mean, we could go on and on and on about the dystopian world we found ourselves in based on a case fatality rate that's far less than 2 out of 102, which is quite high, 2%. It was expected to be higher than that. This was providential that it was only 2. But when they got to the shores, it was winter and their food was running out, and half of the pilgrims starved and died of scurvy and other diseases that winter. And 14 out of the 18 mothers died. This is just heart-wrenching for me to think about. I have a wife and 3 kids, and these mothers, they had very, very limited food. And the mothers died at much higher rates than everybody else. What does that tell you about what the mothers were doing with their food? Because women are pretty hardy. They're not usually the first to die. Usually as we age, women's life expectancy is longer. But 14 out of 18 women died. That's like 75%. half of the people aboard the Mayflower died, they were sharing their food with their little children to keep them alive, to give them that precious heritage of liberty, as we read in the book, The Great Controversy. If you go to Plymouth today, they have 2 statues honoring the women of Plymouth. The only place in the world that honors women with more than one memorial like that. Only 4 families didn't have to bury a family that winter. It was absolutely tragic what took place. But let me skip through that because I want to get to the principles of liberty. When they arrived in Provincetown Harbor in 1620, the hostile Indian tribe is gone. That tribe had cleared the land, so the land is available for farming now. And the other Indian tribes had fled that land because that's where the plague was, and they viewed that as something that you shouldn't be. And so the predominant neighboring tribe wants nothing to do with that particular plot of land, and they are friendly, the Wampanoags, as I mentioned. So you can see God's providence very much interposing here, and they fall upon their knees and they worship the God of heaven, thankful for opening up this place for them to come. But they were supposed to be actually going to Virginia. A south wind had almost dashed their ship against the rocks and destroyed 102 people in the storms of late fall. But there was a south wind, a wind out of the south that was preventing them from getting to their desired destination of Virginia. So God placed them there in Provincetown Harbor in 1620. But since they're not in Virginia, some troublemakers aboard the ship, there were some who were not of the Pilgrims' faith. They said, well, we're not bound by the contract then. So they mutiny. And one of the most remarkable documents in history is written at that time called the Mayflower Compact. This was a statement that all aboard this ship, we will agree together to form our own little decision-making entity, our own little government, our own civil body politic, they called it. And the amazing thing about this document is that it was we, the people, forming our own governmental structure. They didn't get permission from kings, from bishops, from popes. This was not a church state. It was the Pilgrims and others not of their faith who had equal access to the law and protection of the law. And it's the we, the people concept that really established the United States Constitution centuries later. Unbelievers and believers all had freedom of the same kind. That is unheard of. I mean, even these Pilgrims had kind of their cousins, if you will, in England called the Puritans. These guys were separatists. They said we have to separate from the Church of England. It is corrupt. It is papal in its ordinances and its liturgy. But the Puritans said, we're going to stay within that structure of the Anglican Church, but we're going to try to purify it. And so they still had the mindset that we want a church state. And when they founded Massachusetts, later, different colony than Plymouth, Massachusetts established the Puritan religion as its state religion. And if you were Roger Williams, or if you were Anne Hutchinson, you were banished from the colony because you didn't abide by Puritan dogma. Not so with these guys on the Mayflower. The Mayflower Compact said, just as their pastor, John Robinson, had taught them back in the Netherlands, that you treat others as you would want to be treated. You extend liberty of conscience to all. And that was a beautiful truth that people think Roger Williams was the guy that kind of started that, but really the Anabaptists were doing that back in Europe in the 1500s. And the Pilgrim separatists here established that very much with the Mayflower Compact. They understood what Jesus said when he said, the rulers of the Gentiles lorded over them. To lord it over your fellow man and dictate to their conscience what you know is right. You can't force virtue. You can't coerce worship. And he says, Jesus says, those who are of the Gentiles exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. What is it for a Christian? If you want to be great, you're the servant of all. That's a beautiful scripture. So I just wanted to bring out the distinction there. You can see it on the map between Massachusetts Bay versus Plymouth Colony, 2 very different views of church-state relations and religious liberty. The model that America followed eventually was the Plymouth Colony, the separatists, not the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, a couple of quick fun stories from these Pilgrims. During the first year of growing food, when they got help from Squanto, their friend who lived among the Pilgrims, there was a drought. There was a major drought that led them to prayer, and they prayed together with the Wampanoags. They prayed and fasted together, and rain fell like it had never fallen in perfect degree. And it was the most abundant crop that the Indians had ever seen in their lifetime, in their records. providence and prophecy being fulfilled, because this America is going to be the aid of the church. It has to be established. The earth must help out the woman. Well, the first Thanksgiving was 1 year after they landed in 1620, and they had a great harvest that year. I won't tell you all the fun stories about it for the sake of time, but that was an exemplary relationship again that remained for decades. And I think all of us can look back on and say that's a model for how we can conduct ourselves with people who are different in our pluralistic societies. We can have true tolerance, truly coexist with people, and then preach the truth unswervingly and never compromise 1 ounce of truth, but always be filled with 100% grace toward those who choose differently. Well, there was a murder trial in New England where two Englishmen had murdered a native person. And the Wampanoags said, this is going to be the end of our good relationship, because they're probably going to give a show trial here. I mean, it's unheard of that these Europeans would treat Native Americans as equal under the law. But the Pilgrim's judge did find these men guilty, and they were hung. They were executed for their crime of unjustly killing an Indian. Another matter of justice was how this colony did this thing called the common store, which basically you didn't necessarily have to work in order to eat. Everybody could just take from the common store, and somebody else is working hard over here. A guy is really slothful, and they all end up with the same. And Ellen G. White calls that selfish dependence upon others, selfish dependence where you don't exercise manual work yourself, but that you want to have noble independence. And so they changed the model where they said, we're going to go to property ownership. Everybody works. The biblical concept, anyone who does not work shall not eat. And so this family grows this kind of food. This kind of family does this trade and grows this. It was country living. So many virtuous things that we can look back on in history, and how they treated the sick during that winter of starvation, treated the sick even of those profane sailors on that ship who hated the Pilgrims, who threatened to throw them overboard. But anyway, you get the idea of how that works a whole lot better, because that, just like the trying of the murderers, this was another matter of justice and fairness in what it says in the Great Controversy. As tidings spread through the countries of Europe, of a land where every man might enjoy the fruit of his own labor. That's a virtuous thing. And I know people get greedy and covetous, and human sin is an ever-present thing, but the principle of earning the bread by the sweat of the brow and enjoying that and not having it seized upon. But that's not the most important reason people ought to come appreciate a free land. But they came over because they wanted to obey the convictions of their own conscience. That's why thousands flocked to the shores of the New World, and colonies rapidly multiplied, obeying the convictions of your own conscience. Because as you go forward in the history, and you get to the founding of this country, you get the 7 Years' War, you get a 22-year-old British colonel, you may recognize his name, George Washington. And in this battle in 1755, he states, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me. There was so much providence and interposition in the history of raising up what would become now the lamb-like beast of Revelation 13, and its lamb-like qualities being established for the first time in history, a nation of this kind. I have so many stories of miracles and coats shot through and people who should have been killed who didn't, a cluster of miracle stories in the American founding period that I don't have time for, but I do want to make sure. He says this is some interposition of providence that keeps coming in and working miracles in the Revolutionary War. And the miracle of miracles is that in the Declaration of Independence is said they rely on divine providence. And this isn't the army of God. This isn't like Constantine 2.0. I mean, that would be a very erroneous view. And what I want to do with my last 5 minutes is make sure that this grand old document comes through clearly. That's what the Great Controversy calls the Declaration of Independence, because there are 2 potential roads to tyranny. And I unfortunately have to skip through some of the miracle stories, but you send me an email or just go over to the Granite Bay Hilltop Seventh-day Adventist Church. You should see America's 11th Hour, 4 parts, and you'll get them all there. But in the remaining minutes, what makes the American principles, and I don't mean America as chest-thumping nationalism and tribal, we got enough of that division kind of thing, but I just mean those principles, exceptional, distinct, and different. Well, it is a system that neither denies God nor enforces God. You see, Romanism spent 1,260 years enforcing a religion, and a false one at that. But you get a counterpart to that, and you can also see this as the king of the north and the king of the south in Revelation 11. But the counterpart to enforced church-state religion is atheistic, socialistic, Marxist ideology that religion is the opiate of the masses and the state must become supreme. Now you've just got another God in the place of the church. So the church is God over here, the Pope, the papal, supremacy. And then over in this model, the state is God. Church state or atheistic state, both murderous, both oppressive, both dangerous to tyranny. And those things continue on to this day. The French Revolution actually kind of was the opening salvo in taking people this direction, because when they formed their revolution, it wasn't like the Declaration of Independence in America, where it said we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. The French Revolution said, we're going to overthrow all religion. We're going to overthrow, of course, monarchy, the priest class of the Roman Catholic papacy that during the Dark Ages had done so much to destroy and kill and massacre and torture through the Inquisitions and through the St. Bartholomew's massacre in France. The French Revolution had a good memory of what religion had done to them, and they took it out on the God of heaven and the Bible and Christianity, and threw the baby out with the bathwater, not just overthrowing the papal power. And so religion was outlawed in the French Revolution. They said it is inherently bad and violent and oppressive. Well, was it so amongst the Pilgrims? Was it so among the Anabaptists of the 16th century Europe? Not so. But during that French Revolution, you're going to get what you're going to get. When you de-Christianize a nation and you put the state as God, they were so hard on King Louis, who said, I am the state. But then they have reason being the God that they worshiped. And it became the most irrational committees of public safety, they called it in France, to try to liquidate the nation of all opponents of the revolution, who would be any of the nobility, anybody who might even speak out against the violence and bloodshed, because Robespierre's committees of public safety are known in the history books as the reign of terror. When you put man as a tyrant, it always leads to terror. And we ignore the lessons of history at our own peril, by the way. You see, both of these examples are almost every government that has ever existed throughout history. Liberty is a scarce thing. And so if we think, human sin and the natural tendencies of the human heart to seek power over others, if we think those are somehow expired or gone for the time in which we live, and there are no nefarious agendas, we need to think again, because if we don't learn history, we are doomed to repeat it. Also, we can learn, public safety. They might call it things that sound nice, right? Public safety, public health, Homeland Security. That the final events of Revelation 13 will go forward with a veneer and a propaganda overlay that will sound virtuous, that will sound beneficent. But here we have the Protestant Republic. That's a contrast to both of these two, and we can all live that out in our own way, in our own hearts as well, extending liberty and joy and peace to all those around us. I quoted this already from the Declaration of Independence, but to sum that up, the American Republic, founded by Protestants, acknowledges the Creator, but doesn't enforce a religion, and it doesn't restrict freedom of conscience. And that's why going global, not out of France, not out of Rome, but from America going global, came the 19th century missionary work and the Bible societies and the great Second Advent Awakening. And that's a good place to stop, because remember that first baby born. And remember that link between the earth helped the woman and the remnant church of Bible prophecy. So we can see, when we study history, the joy of prophecy fulfilled. We can learn the principles of true religious freedom that are so needed at this time, as we are tactful but bold advocates for those who are oppressed and those whose human rights are violated under the thumb of overreaching powers of this age. And we can say, we will reflect God's character and speak to his character as we teach the doctrine of religious liberty in the context of the great controversy. So that's it for now, and I'll hand it back over to our hosts. And thank you again, everybody, for having me. It's been a true joy and blessing to spend this brief time with you. And let's have a closing prayer as we close this session. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your goodness and love. We thank you for your character as revealed in the truth about freedom, that you didn't even force the worship of the fallen angels of heaven who rebelled against you, but you've allowed this to manifest so all can choose you freely and intelligently, that we can use reason, true reason, and never descend into the anarchy and the darkness of this world, but always be lifted up to the light of heaven as we behold the face of Jesus. In his name we pray.